You're listening to Life, the Universe, and Everything Else. Today on the show, we're talking about counter-apologetics.
Life, the Universe, and Everything Else is a program promoting secular humanism and scientific skepticism, produced by the Winnipeg Skeptics. You can email your questions, comments, or criticisms to us at LUEEpodcast@winnipegskeptics.com. Show notes, references, and relevant links can be found at lueepodcast.wordpress.com or at winnipegskeptics.com/blog.
So I had a weird experience the other day, before we actually start talking about our topic. I was at Canadian Blood Services. I was going through the pre-screening before I donate blood. It's always the same. Are you gay? No. Have you ever been to Africa ever? No. I'm usually fine. I take medication, so I have to tell them every single time, yes, I've taken medication in the last 3 days, and it's for this, and you don't need to worry about it. But this time, I also had ticked the yes, I had a vaccination recently. So the nurse, after the screening, she said to me, I noticed you said you got the flu vaccine. Do you find that really helps you?
Wow, the nurse.
Yeah, and that's a hard question to answer because... Yeah. And what I said to her, I tried to be very nice, but what I said is, I try not to make health decisions based on my personal experience. And that may seem counterintuitive, but my personal experience is bound to be non-representative and full of all sorts of bias. Instead, I like to base my health decisions on rigorous statistics. And also, I have people in my life who, it would be a major problem for them if they got influenza. And...
Right.
less of an issue for me, and I don't want to be a vector for them. There are lots of reasons that people think that the flu vaccine doesn't work, like the fact that when you have the flu, it's often not influenza, it's some other flu-like illness and that, but it's just...
Or even just a cold that you feel crappy.
Yeah. But just the fact that she asked me that question, just as a healthcare provider...
Yeah, that's not great.
The implication in her eyes was... Oh, you're one of those flu vaccine people, I see.
Well, and she probably has to get it as a part of her job, mandatory.
Sometimes people fight that.
Oh, I guess.
Nurses, too.
Yeah. Although you saying that you were at Canadian Blood Services, yay, we're finally going to get rid of the men who have sex with men ban, yay.
So they did shorten it down to 5 years. Are they getting rid of it completely?
The new Liberal government has said that they're going to reevaluate it and base it on science.
Good.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
So I'm going to be able to give blood again. It's really exciting.
That is a good thing. Because, really, we need more blood donors, not less.
Yeah, and I have the least in-demand blood, but I'm sure there are some O-negative people out there who can now give blood again. So I'm AB positive, so the only people I can give blood to are fellow AB positive people, which are 5% of the population.
Yeah.
But I can take blood from anyone.
Take.
I'm a taker.
I have probably the most unfortunate donating blood situation in that I was so gung-ho to do it, and my mother-in-law took us, but we couldn't find parking, so we left.
Oh, no. At least you can try again.
We could just do this another day, guys. When we can't find any parking, we'll go out for lunch and we'll come do this another day. So we went out for Vietnamese, and then I never
came back.
Which is very sad. I legitimately, super finally I'm giving blood. I'm this. I feel good about it. I'm doing it, and then there was no parking. So really, it's the city of Winnipeg's fault. I feel really it's their fault.
So today we're talking about counter-apologetics.
I don't think you introduced us at the beginning. Do you want to do that?
I was thinking that too.
Yeah, we jumped right in.
Let's do it. Okay. Joining me tonight, we have Ashlyn Noble.
Hello.
Laura Creek-Newman.
Hi there.
And Ian James.
I'm going to make my business for a new noise every time.
Are they all going to be variations on an evil laugh?
Yes.
Okay.
Evil laugh, really? That's how you...
it was sort of a pirate laugh.
Okay.
So pirates can be evil bastards.
So let's start very basic. What is an apologetic? Anyone?
Someone who's very sorry.
That's what I would say. That's the smart-ass answer.
Yeah. I can always be counted on for those.
Me too.
So apologetic comes from the Greek apologia, which means to speak in defense. It's also where we get the English word apologize. And just as a note, speaking in defense is a terrible way of apologizing. Anyway, apologetics is the defense of faith, as articulated, for example, in 1 Peter 3:15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So Christians in the Christian Bible are charged with giving a defense of their faith. They're told that when people ask them why they believe, they should have answers, right? So that's where apologetics comes from. Typically, those outside of a faith, whether they're non-believers in general or just members of a different religion, will encounter apologetics when missionaries attempt to convert them. You know, they come and they try to convince us that their God is the right God and that whatever, heathen deity we worship is not as good. Crom or Cthulhu or
Thor.
What have you.
Odin or whomever you...
That guy's got a day named after him. I mean, obviously, he knows what's going on. I've been on the receiving end of apologetics from Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and Scientologists. And
Mormons too, Jem.
Yeah. I've actually spent many a pleasant Christmas Eve talking to Mormon elders on the phone. So I'm pretty well versed in these arguments, and I typically enjoy the discussion that ensues. I recently had a visit from a couple of very nice fellows from a local church, which I wrote up for my blog. I'll post a link in the show notes. So counter-apologetics involves studying apologetic arguments, arguments that attempt to prove a religion true or prove the existence of God, and learning where and why they fall down. Often they rely on one or more false premises or logical fallacies, or they merely attempt to engage in emotional manipulation. But maybe let's start the discussion with this question. Is this worth doing? Is counter-apologetics just a waste of time? Is even talking about belief or non-belief in God with, people trying to convert you, is that a waste of time?
I don't think so, but
you're actually asking.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I thought it was one of those gem questions where you ask
question.
in the intention of answering your own question. But yes.
He does do that.
I assumed when you said one of those gem questions, rhetorical questions were gem questions, but no, this is a specific type of question where I just...
You ask the question, and then you answer it, which is fine, because you usually
also
have the
known
best
as
answer.
the lazy Socratic method.
Yeah, lazy man's Socratic method. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say, I also enjoy talking to people about their beliefs and trying to ask them why they believe that the way they do. And I actually didn't know that the Bible says that you should have answers to those questions, which I kind of like. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, 1 Peter 3:15.
Okay.
Always be ready to give the reason.
But I don't know. I guess I'm an argumentative person at heart. We actually are brand new aunts and uncle again. We have a new niece. And we were heading to the hospital to, I guess, hold the new baby this weekend. And the first thing I asked was like, oh, is it one of the days where there's protesters outside? Because it's the women's pavilion. And I was like, oh, I hope there's protesters so I can talk to them. And if you go back and listen to our Skepticon episode, you can hear all about my experiences with the fun protesters outside Skepticon.
Yeah.
But I really enjoy talking to people and being like, so you have this belief. That belief is wrong. Let me, ask you questions about that belief until you also understand that you are wrong.
Do you feel like we as sort of skeptics, sort of by our nature, are an argumentative lot?
Not
do you think
always.
That's just kind of part of it?
Yeah, I think there's some of it, yeah.
I find myself biting my tongue. I'm, in a lot of situations, but I also find myself in a lot of situations, especially at work, as being that guy at work. Like, oh, don't get them started on ghosts or horoscopes or psychics or all the other stuff. And there are people that I work with who are not only, religious, but they do believe in all that other stuff. And it just, it makes me want to tear my goddamn hair out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that brand of skeptic, but then there's also the brand of skeptic that is very much like choose your battles. And there's those skeptics as well who are, I'm just going to believe what I believe and I have my beliefs, but you believe whatever you want.
And I think that we all have that side of us as well, that, you see something on Facebook that maybe was liked by someone else. It's one of those sort of
Yeah.
You're not friends with them, but
you saw
one of your
it.
friends liked one of their things, and it's like, well,
Joseph Smith liked Angel Moroni.
I'm friends with Angel Moroni on Facebook, if you didn't know. Like, for example, somebody saying, and I mean, again, it's not to be insensitive, but it's, my aunt has cancer or what have you, and, everybody send your prayers and this and that to her, and may Jesus guide her through this rough time. And, you just want to say, like, well, what if your aunt just passes away tomorrow? Then what? But you can't
Not
say
enough
that.
prayers.
Yeah, not enough prayers. Oh, well, it was God's will, blah, blah, blah. But you just, you want to bite you don't want to, like, start typing snarky comments because it's somebody's aunt. But at the same time, you also, at least a part of me, I'll speak for myself, there's a part of me that wants to be like, does that really do anything? Like, you want to challenge them in this sort of, there's something they're putting out there in the public, that on Facebook is more or less public, at least to everybody else. And you want to challenge them, but you don't have the heart to do so.
I guess just hearing you explain that, it's like, yeah, I'm definitely a choose your battles kind of subject. Because depending on what it is, something like that, I would probably just let it go as much as
I did, for the record.
Yeah, sure. But as much as I, am on board with a lot of the things that you're saying, it's like, this is a touchy subject. And I mean, so long as, the person towards whom you're directing the comments and that would actually find comfort in what you're trying to say, this is a crappy situation.
No, they would not.
Yeah, and that's another story for another time, unfortunately. But, like, that's a touchy one. But if it's just like, you should never eat this food, I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
This is why.
Yeah.
That's a very good point, because it depends on the context.
Yeah,
If
absolutely. And I think just as skeptics, the bar for other people to determine whether or not we are argumentative is so much lower than for other people, because we're often saying things that are not like the accepted wisdom or just, the folklore that everybody just goes along with.
So anything we say is considered argumentative.
Also a good
Exactly.
point. Also a very good
so I think
point.
it's just the fact that a lot of times the fact that we say something that is not what is expected or socially accepted in a way,
based
like,
on facts and research.
And
Yeah.
the people that we are, too, are skeptics who are willing to put our voices on a podcast every month.
Right.
And so the skeptics that are willing to be on podcasts, and even the skeptics who listen to a lot of podcasts about these sorts of topics, are more likely, I think, to be the argumentative ones.
Sure.
Rather than the ones who are just like, I'm totally on board with scientific skepticism, but it's not a big part of my life. I don't think those are super argumentative people, probably.
We are the cream that is floated.
Exactly. Sure. You can put it that way.
Did that even answer your question, Jim? Because I think it's time for you to answer the question.
In a roundabout way. Just for myself, I find myself wanting to engage in those sorts of discussions when it is not invited less and less.
Okay.
Yes.
If somebody just posts something that is nonsense, unless it is imminently dangerous nonsense, I'd say 80-90% of the time I'll just let it go. Often, that's because I don't particularly like arguing, honestly. Like, I don't like adversarial conversations. I like a dialogue, and I like to present new ideas and talk about new ideas and hear other people's perspectives. And obviously, I think that the things that I think are right, but I also know that some of them might be wrong.
Yeah.
Because that's certainly happened before. And, so I want to get their perspective as well. But in a lot of these cases, when it's unsolicited, it will end up being very adversarial immediately. And that's just, I don't have time for that. I don't need to get my blood pressure up. I've got a family history of heart disease.
But
Yeah.
do you find that or maybe I'll rephrase this. I don't find that that a skeptical dialogue is ever invited, or I don't find myself being invited to engage in those types of conversations with people. It's always me that has to start it up. And maybe that's a flaw of mine, that like you were saying, you don't want to be when it's unsolicited, when it's like when someone says,
like, sometimes
well,
I
Jesus,
will, if somebody's out there preaching that vaccines are causing autism,
Yeah.
like, that's important. So
I'm on my way to the
something I
homeopathic
don't like.
clinic. You may say something. My child's going to the homeopathic clinic. He's got a very bad cough. Maybe I'll step up and say something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I guess, do you guys find in your experiences, I would imagine the answer is probably no, but do you guys find people welcome you into their dialogue when you have an opposing idea? When it's this kind of stuff, like the religious sort of belief system stuff? Because I don't. No one ever does ever.
I feel like when people are actively protesting something, I think that is an invitation.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's fair. Or when they come to your damn door. Then it's like, hey, you're at
then
my door,
they
pal.
want to talk to you. And I mean, if they're... The example from Skepticon was people standing outside of Skepticon asking, do you go to church on Sunday? And I was like, yes, I do go to church. Let's talk. It's not the kind of church you think it is, but...
And if we had vaccine deniers coming to our door to talk, I would be happy to talk to them too. And I like that invitation to a dialogue.
Sure.
With vaccine deniers, I think that it's worth getting outside of my personal comfort zone and the way I like to spend my time in order to counter these claims. But
And sometimes, too, you'll see posts where somebody will just post a link to something, or with, some people will just do the thoughts ? And so those are cases where I feel like
it's an invitation.
It's perfect. It is it's an
absolutely.
invitation,
Right.
and it's perfectly acceptable to be like, wow, this article is bullshit, in the most tactful way you can manage.
Which in your case is, wow, this article is bullshit.
All the time, yeah.
What was your initial question, Jam? I'm sorry.
So,
Is apologetics worth it?
Is it
or
worth
is
it?
And
counter-apologetics
counter-apologetics worth it,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
Entering into a dialogue about the existence or non-existence of
Right.
God.
Well, okay. I think it's worth it in the regards that I would love for more people to at least, well, with all subjects, to think more critically. We've said this a million times in this podcast. People should think more critically and skeptically. However, do you honestly think that you can convince someone who's been a believer all their life to not believe in God? I've never seen it. So
Yeah,
is it a waste of time? Is it worth it? In the grand scheme of things, probably not.
So it depends what you're going after. Like,
Yeah.
I don't go into these conversations expecting to convince the other person that their God of choice doesn't exist. You're definitely not going to do that immediately. They're not going to say, oh, shit, you're right. Sorry. I'm
You're
going
right.
to knock on doors for atheism now,
Especially for missionaries.
Right.
You're not going to
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
them out of it immediately.
Yeah.
But you can hope to plant a seed. Mm-hmm. You can also hope to learn about
That's a good point.
about why they believe what they do, and whether or not you think that what they believe is right, or whether or not you can use that knowledge. I feel like learning about how other people think is just kind of a useful life skill.
That is fair. That it may be not about you converting them, but you yourself gaining some knowledge that you didn't have before.
And at the very least,
That
just
you can learn from somebody that you may not have had access to.
and reminding them that, hey, we exist too, even though we're not out there knocking on your door saying, hey, by the way, here's the good news, there ain't no God.
We should totally do that.
Even though we're not doing that, we still exist. And we have, a right to this space and this culture as well.
The other part that I think is really important that I always come back to is the same reason that I was arguing for the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate, is that you're not, at least I'm not really trying to convince the person I'm talking to, but there's always bystanders. There's always
Right.
people watching.
Exactly.
And, especially I think it's the Jehovah's Witnesses will often bring their kids along. And so when you're talking to them and presenting your arguments against God, it kind of opens the door to, other people believe in this other thing. That's kind of cool. And, and that's the planting the seed thing, but not necessarily in the person you're talking to, but in anybody who's watching around you.
Yeah.
Fair.
Or I've had missionaries come to the door, often in pairs, and when they're not Mormons, they're both around the same age, right?
Yeah.
20 years old, 18 to 20. But when they're not Mormons, there's often like one that's older and one that's younger. And I've had plenty of conversations where the younger one was kind of nodding along and the older one was like, okay, well, we're done here. It's time to go.
Yeah. Convincing.
Oh no, it's one of them, the atheists. Run!
And I do want to stress that counter-apologetics isn't just for non-believers. It's not like Mormons are only knocking on atheists' doors, right? Mm-hmm. Being able to engage in these discussions thoughtfully and actually attempting to understand other points of view is important. And we're all subject to these kind of clashes of worldviews. So I also find that these arguments are interesting philosophically. I like them in the same way that I like math I like logic problems.
Nerd.
So I know. So that's one of the reasons that I really love wrangling with these metaphysical issues.
I do too.
And that's a fair reason to do it,
Yeah.
even if you're not talking to anybody about it, just researching it.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions that I like to ask a believer who's come to convert me is this hypothetical. What about the world would be different if there were no God? So you obviously think the world is the way it is because there's, some God or gods
Sure.
exist. What would change if there were no God?
So I would like to ask a clarifying question. Mm-hmm. If there had been no God from the beginning, or if there suddenly was no God?
Either one.
So I think as a believer, I would say if there was no God to start with, then none of this would be here.
Right. But that's kind of a deistic argument. And some of these
Sure.
arguments that we'll get into are deistic, but most believers believe that their God is intercessory in some way.
Yeah.
The way I see it, good things and bad things would still happen, but they would happen at random. Good things would happen to good people and bad things would happen to bad people and good people. Kind of the way it already happens. People would still win the lottery. Doctors would still save lives. Amputees who prayed would still not regrow their limbs. It seems like the God hypothesis is unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
What about the people who would say that, well, if there ain't no God, then what's stopping me from killing and raping and stealing and doing all those other things we're not supposed to do?
Well, and that's actually it is one of the questions
In that exact accent.
that got asked when these folks knocked on my door a couple weeks ago. And
They seriously asked you that? Sorry to interrupt, Jim. How did they so you asked them the question, and they said they
asked, well, what's to stop
okay.
you from or what's to stop a person? And I said, well, God clearly doesn't stop them.
Yeah.
First of all,
Right.
But
Good point.
Second of all, the reason people decide to do or not do these things is because we're social animals, and most of us have a well-developed and well-exercised sense of empathy for our fellow creatures, our fellow beings.
Yeah.
Creature actually implies creation, by the way, so I try to avoid using that, but sometimes it slips out.
Right.
And unfortunately, there are people who don't have that same sense of empathy, and I feel like we still need to be compassionate for these people because, in a sense, it's not their fault that they have that lack of empathy. We also need to be careful, so we need to protect ourselves and each other from, sociopaths. But the reason we don't go out and do terrible things is because it would hurt others around us, and we care about our society and we care about our loved ones, and we wouldn't want other people to do that to us, and society would function less and less well if people did that.
Yeah, that question always really, really disturbs me when people bring it up.
It seems to imply that that's what they want.
Exactly.
And the only thing that is stopping them is this God idea. And hey, if you need that to stop, by all means.
Yeah, please believe
let's
in God
end
if
this
that's the only
conversation
thing
now. I don't want
stopping
to
you.
risk deconverting you.
Yeah. And it's very disturbing to me that the only reason that they're not out there raping and murdering and stealing is because they think God is watching them.
And I think that they're not. I
well,
think
no,
that
but that's what the question is implying.
it's the same conservative hard on crime mentality.
Yeah.
Harsher sentences don't result in drops in crime, as we discussed on our recent podcast, but people like to pretend that they're a deterrent, right?
Yeah. And I don't think that if they suddenly stop believing in God that they would go out and do those things, but it disturbs me that they think that way.
I agree. Of course, there are a percentage of people who would, because they are, as you said, sociopaths or what have you. But the larger majority, I should say, of people who say, well, what's to stop me from going to... They wouldn't actually do it if somehow it was...
I think a
God
lot of
was
those people are
disproven.
concerned that other people might.
Sure. And I think that they're even just the people who say that are even just sort of puffing their chest a little bit. They're just sort of, putting out a hypothetical. Well, what's to stop me from doing this? So you better believe in it. You know what I'm saying? Like they don't actually think that they would do it.
Also kind of a veiled threat.
It is a little bit. I think it is a little bit of a veiled threat. Absolutely.
So let's get into the arguments then. I'll start us all off with a softball because it's probably the most common one that I hear, and it still surprises me every time I hear it. So the argument for the existence of God is, look at the trees.
Yeah.
I usually say something like, yeah, they're pretty nice.
Good trees.
Apparently, when Ham, the humanist, atheist, and agnostics of Manitoba, goes down to Morden for the Corn and Apple Festival every year to promote atheism, they get that like once an hour. Look at the trees.
And, there's a perfectly naturalistic explanation for trees, for the record. And even if there weren't, even if we had no idea where the fuck trees came from, just saying, well, some sort of deity came down and created them, or set this whole thing in motion, that is an argument from ignorance, right? It's saying, because you don't have a better explanation, we're going to go with my explanation.
It's the classic conspiracy theorist. I'm going to digress ever so slightly. I've been listening to a podcast, a wrestling podcast that...
I'm shocked.
I know, right? That Jesse Ventura was on.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Of course, he's a,
Yep.
Well, what about this? It was Chris Jericho's podcast, I should say. So, well, what about, listen to this, Chris. The FBI, and he would go onto this thing, and then he would ask a question at the end of the thing, like, well, the FBI did this and this and this. So what happened to this guy? And so he asks the question, but doesn't actually answer that question. He just makes it seem like it's a really, really valid question to ask, as if there is a viable answer. But he doesn't actually supply the answer to that makes sense. That is also, that's what I think. I feel a lot of conspiracy theorists. Well, what about this? This seems weird. What about that? But they don't actually go the next step and say, well, okay, this is what it is, and they explain that next part. And I feel this is sort of similar to that. It's like, well, what about the trees? What about them? Inject the next part of that, answer that question for me, and I'll be happy to discuss it. But you can't, because there is...
Yeah, so, like, that you're talking about is called anomaly hunting. They like to poke holes in the official story or whatever.
Right.
And then fill in whatever nebulous gaps that the official story, whatever that means, has with a generic, non-specific conspiracy theory. Something nebulous that presumably would explain, whatever anomalies they find in, Building 7 of the World Trade Center or whatever. But they don't like to provide they don't like to put their nickel down on a concrete thing for conspiracy theories, because as soon as they have an official story of their own, then people can start poking holes in that.
That's
like,
also true.
Well, where did those missiles come from?
Yeah, they just keep the burden of proof on everybody else.
And that is kind of like a conspiracy theory of the gaps argument, right?
Almost.
Yeah, it's a God of the gaps argument. So as soon as we explain trees with evolution, by the way, is one of the hypothetical explanations for the existence of trees. Natural selection. Pretty good stuff. So then they'll move on to the next thing. Well, where did the first cell come from? So now we're talking abiogenesis, and we have some viable theories to explain that as well. And then they're like, okay, well, where did the universe come from? So we have to keep following it back, and there's always more things that could be explained. And that's a God of the gaps argument, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we've dealt with the trees. Let's start taking on some meatier topics. Ashlyn, do you want to talk to us about how miracles prove the existence of God?
I do. So, because supernatural things happen, there must be a God. That seems to be the argument.
Sounds
Okay.
legit.
So premise 1,
Super legit.
supernatural stuff happens.
Yeah. So that's
Premise
the
2,
Supernatural
God
shit happens.
caused it.
God must be responsible for all supernatural phenomena.
Yeah.
Premise 3, therefore God. I think we have a problem in premises 1 and 2.
Does that make the third one actually a premise, though?
The third one would be the conclusion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I think you said
You said premise 3.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Jam screwed up. Yes, Jam screwed up.
Well, it happens so rarely.
I know. Now it's on tape. Not literal.
Not for long, I'm controlling the edit.
And not literal tape. It's an expression. Yeah. Anyway.
So a lot of people, when you say, I really don't believe that God exists, they will try and prove you wrong by telling you about personal experiences of miracles that they have witnessed.
Yep.
And so one of the ones that came to mind when I got this topic was my best friend's mom. And so we were talking about, I guess she had found out that I don't believe in God at one point. And she just was very earnestly telling me, well, Ashlyn, I know there's a God, because when my daughter was very young, I was getting out of a semi with her, and I was holding her in my arms, and I fell, and I would have fallen right onto her, onto the concrete, and she would be dead. But I felt the arms of an angel around me lift me back into the truck, and that's how I know there is a God.
But not like an alien that
No,
happened to be there.
definitely not an alien. Almost certainly God.
Yeah. Some sort of
Because
tractor beam,
because
what if
that
it
is
was
what she
Kirk?
believes
Yeah.
in.
psychokinesis.
Yeah. So whenever you get one of these claims, you have to, I mean, what I did in the time, and I think I was probably 13 or 14, was just like, okay, I'm sure that was very, affirming for you, and try and drop the topic.
But now,
Yeah, now it's more like, so were you really falling, or did you just have one of those moments where you feel like you lost your balance and then you righted yourself?
are you remembering the story correctly? Like,
Yeah.
is your memory kind of playing tricks on you a
Yeah,
little bit?
you've retold
Or,
it so many times.
Lucky things happen all the time. Unlucky things also happen all the time, but we tend to really remember those times where it really mattered.
Where things worked out, yeah.
Exactly.
The life of your child is one of those things that
such a-
matter.
Precisely.
Such a good point. You remember the times when it was significant, and you immediately forget all the times where there was no significance.
Yeah, and
It's
there's
like,
no, there's
I
no.
put one foot in front of the other again and again and again and again. Woohoo! Today was a good day.
And there's no parity in terms of blame, right?
Yeah. Parity, as opposed to
Yeah.
Parody.
Yeah, parity.
Parity.
Sounds the same.
Is that derived from a parrot?
No.
It's not like Parroty.
Fine.
It's
just
not
trying to-
like as a parrot.
I'm just trying to ask a question, man. I thought this what this podcast was all about.
I think what Jem is getting at is that God doesn't get blamed for the crappy things that happen.
Yeah,
Right,
like so
exactly.
the one angel saved her, but what about the angel that pushed her out of the truck?
Yeah.
Good point. Well, that was the devil,
You know,
obviously.
so
exactly.
in that case, obviously, let's assume that she was in fact touched by an angel. Let's assume she was touched by an angel.
Jem, let's keep it clean around here.
No. Oh boy, okay.
Nailed it.
That's what she said. That's what the angel said.
That's right. That's what the angels.
Actually, all the angels in the Bible are male.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you go.
Anyway,
What about the angel that pushed her? Yeah.
right. So like obviously terrible things do happen. So God is picking and choosing who gets saved. I guess it's kind of a dick move.
Very much so.
But it is God gets all of the the adulation, all of the thanks, but never gets any of the blame.
Yeah. As Jem was saying, the first thing that we have to figure out with this argument is, did anything supernatural actually happen? And pretty much always the answer is no, or we don't know.
Yeah.
100% of
Right.
the time.
And don't know is perfectly legitimate, as
Yeah.
we talked about with the God of the Gaps argument or the argument from ignorance, right? Just because we don't have an explanation doesn't mean it was your pet
The explanation
theory.
is
Yeah.
gone.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so there are a number of these miracles that are attested to by the church.
Sure.
Things like the appearance of in the sun at Fatima.
Right. Yes.
A few appearances of the Virgin Mary, stuff like that.
In a sandwich.
Sure,
Or
I
grilled
don't think that's
cheese.
been.
Yeah,
I don't think that's been attested.
I mean, I saw it on Penn and Teller bullshit.
And so, but we just don't have any reliable way of testing those claims. So there's all kinds of things that could explain it. Mass hysteria has a lot of evidence for things like this, and one of the biggest problems is that the more you want a miracle to happen, the more you're likely to see one.
Yeah. And it is actually astonishingly easy to, say, make up a claim that an entire town saw something and then repeat that claim. And other people will say, oh, that's interesting. I will engage in no fact checking because I trust you.
Absolutely.
Or because I don't have any particular reason to trust you, but you told me something. And as we discussed last episode, that's good enough for me.
Right.
And it just gets repeated. And suddenly everybody's
Decided that it's
decided
true.
that it's true. And it
Yeah.
just gets repeated.
Well, and even if you say, my whole town saw this thing, and then it spreads, and somebody comes to this town and goes, did you see this thing that everybody's talking about? You'll get a lot of people saying yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Right? If something salacious happens. I mean, I'm from a small town, something salacious happens in the town. everyone was there. Oh, I saw it. I saw so-and-so kiss so-and-so. Oh, really? So there was like 30 people watching these people make out? Like, how many people were actually there watching?
Yeah.
Because it becomes this sort of like cult.
This Emperor's New Clothes sort of thing.
Yes,
that's going on.
exactly.
Yeah.
That is,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's also people, we generate false memories all the time, and Ian was alluding to this earlier. As you tell stories, if somebody told you that something happened, and you're repeating that story, and you repeat it's a great story, so you repeat it often enough, people will start to think that it happened to them. And false memories have been induced in psychological studies many times. I don't trust my own memory about things that happened. It's my memory is kind of like Wikipedia, It's maybe a good first approximation, but don't rely on it as your sole source.
Yeah.
Right.
Don't turn it in for a paper in university.
Yeah,
exactly.
probably not.
It's not going to work.
Now, it seems to me that the number of miracle claims must be on the decline now that we all have camera phones and everything gets recorded all of the time. Because
I think so.
But I guess maybe the number of claims might be up, but the number of people or the amount that might be, attested to the extraordinary ones, the ones that everybody actually says, oh yeah,
like
no,
the
this
sun
thing
dancing
happened.
in the sky.
I can only imagine it's going down because there's more actual evidence that other outside sources can say, oh no, that's a sunspot, or this is a solar flare, or this is a that, or this is a that, or
people
this is
staring into the
right?
sun for
Because I'm thinking
If you can find a video of a cat running into a wall or something like that, surely there would be a video of the sun moving around in the sky.
Well,
That
the
seems
thing,
like a
the thing
pretty
is, Ian,
legitimate.
God is
especially
shy.
if
He's
it's
really
like-
shy, and he doesn't want the NSA to steal personal
God,
information.
God went into your phone. He knows
Deleted
your
the picture,
password because he's
Right.
God, and he erased that one video on your phone.
Right.
Sorry.
And then let a bunch of people starve to death. He's pretty concerned about your phone, but those people who are starving,
Absolutely. So, I don't know. I'm just it's just sort of conjecture here, but I'm thinking that the miracle claims that people know about, that, have made the rounds around the world and such like that, are things that had happened a long time ago now. And there's really no very limited evidence for things and things that are happening more. Sure, I'm assuming people are making claims all the time, but a lot of that is a lot more testable.
Everybody wants their own 15 minutes of fame.
Right.
And an easy way to get it is to say, I saw this miracle.
Absolutely.
But there's still places like, I can't remember his name, the very famous Indian skeptic.
Sanal Edamaruku.
Yes. He was arrested and chased out of the country because he went to investigate a claim that a statue of, I think, Mary was crying.
Yeah.
And he can't go back home now because he was like, yeah, it's just capillary action, dudes. And now he's being chased around the world for blasphemy.
Yeah, and that's the same skeptic who basically, there was a yogi who was claiming that he could perform miracles, and he was like, nope, don't believe it. And the guy's like, well, you better be careful, because otherwise I could bring a curse down upon you. Sanal was like, bring it, man.
Yeah.
And on live TV, this guy was like throwing curses at him for a while and brandishing like a ceremonial knife, and, Sanal was just sort of sitting there laughing, and yeah, it was amazing.
And he was basically like, okay, if you can kill me with your mind, do it.
Yep.
And nothing.
if he had actually at that moment had a heart attack or something,
Worst luck ever.
right?
Absolutely.
It'd be like, ooh, maybe we should just stop this podcast because maybe it's true, or maybe it's just bad luck.
So even if we determined that one individual miracle was in fact something supernatural happened, which I don't know how we would do that because we still don't really know all the laws of nature.
Right.
But
so how are we going to know the laws of supernature?
Yeah. So let's just assume that we've fulfilled the first criteria, something supernatural happened.
Mm-hmm.
The second criteria is God did it. And usually a specific God.
Right.
So even if, a Christian person prays and their father is healed from his heart attack or whatever, was it the Christian God? Was it the Hindu God? Was it an alien? That's another thing that we just have no way to prove.
I'm Christian, but somehow Ganesh healed my father. Thank you, I appreciate that, but I wasn't talking to you. I was talking to the other God.
And I wanted
Stay
to...
out of it next time, Ganesh. I don't know if Ganesh heals people. I
have
threw
no
a name
idea.
out there.
I wanted to read a passage that I really enjoyed from a page that I was researching from. It's from argumentsforatheism.com. And
We'll link to it in the show notes.
Yeah. The passage says, even if a miraculous event is indeed exceptional enough to warrant an exceptional explanation, there is no reason to jump to the conclusion that it was caused by the incredible powers of a god's mind. It can just as easily be argued that, for example, the incredible powers of a human's mind or the cumulative powers of many humans is just as likely and unlikely an explanation. After all, at least human minds are known to exist, while the existence of a god's mind is in dispute.
Whoa.
So I liked that.
Makes sense.
You know, we don't have an explanation for this thing that happened, even if it is supernatural. And so
And that's okay.
neither of the two premises are falsifiable or provable. So
If you haven't listened to
Good.
it, listen to this. I believe it's called Thank You, God by Tim Minchin. I'm sure you know that song.
Yep.
Jim. That very nicely and comically sums up what we're talking about in this subject. I won't go into it because I'll just ruin it. I will shit all over the comedy of that song. So just go and watch it.
Well, and I guess the biggest thing that Christian believers point to when they talk about argument from miracles is Christ rising from the dead. They say, well, that was a miracle and it couldn't possibly have happened if God didn't exist. Therefore, God.
Right.
So, I mean, first of all, you have to believe that all of that happened. And
Right, exactly.
So,
yeah, there's a
there's
lot of
kind of
assumptions going on ahead of that conclusion.
and that is the argument from miracles.
Cool.
Good.
Okay, so I'm going to give a very brief summary of one of the dumbest arguments for God.
Oh, goody.
This is more common among philosophers and less common among feet-on-the-street missionaries. But this is the ontological argument. Just gonna make it as brief as possible and as high level as possible. So the ontological argument is one of the classic arguments for the existence of God, and it goes like this. God is the best. Things that exist are better than things that don't. Therefore, God exists.
How do they know that things that exist are better than things that don't?
So the actual argument tends to be phrased in a much more convoluted way,
Sure.
and more recent adaptations use modal logic. But at its core, the argument assumes that the idea of greatness is intelligible and quantifiable, and that a maximally great being requires the property of existence. That is to say, that things that exist in all possible worlds are greater than things that don't.
Sure.
Let's assume that that's right. Please consider the following arguments. Minotaurs are the best animals. Animals that exist are better than animals that don't. Therefore, minotaurs exist.
They do?
That is awesome.
Or, if we want to take a different route, God is the best. Things that are great mustache waxes are better than things that aren't great mustache waxes. Therefore, God is a great mustache wax.
Say that 5 times fast.
So I'm not going to dive deep into like Platynga's modal logic argument, because it would probably eat up all of the remaining time on the podcast, and if you don't have a philosophy background, it's pretty difficult to follow. But
We do have 7 hours left on this SD card if you want to get into it.
if you're interested and you have 7 hours, look it up, and I'll put links in the show notes. But, TLDR, trying to define something into existence is dumb. We should, look at the actual world rather than just the world in our brains and trying to prove that things exist or don't, I think. Laura was going to tell us about the Euthyphro dilemma. So this, rather than being an argument for the existence of God that we'll talk about, this is actually the rare argument against a certain type of God, a moral lawgiver. So, Laura, why don't you take us through it?
Right. So the Euthyphro dilemma is actually, it was first posed by Plato in his work Euthyphro, where Socrates is talking to the person Euthyphro and says the following: is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? So a more modernized and clearer way of thinking of this is, are morally good acts willed by God because they are morally good, or are they morally good because they are willed by God? So does God like things that are already good, or by God liking something, does that make it good? That's the question that is posed there. So, so from the time of Plato up until today, people are still talking about this and philosophizing around it.
Yeah,
and
but
such.
it assumes the existence of God
right
in there. So
it does, but it's also a very common dilemma that is posed for that apologetics tries to deal with, and then that counter-apologetics can deal with.
Yeah,
as well.
like the reason is because people will often make a moral case.
Right,
God.
like
God
we were
exists
saying
because
before,
morals
if
exist.
there was no God, what would stop me from
then there would
yada
be
yada,
no
right?
morals,
So
because
this
God
is
loves morals.
How do you explain the existence of, morality? We all agree that certain things are wrong and certain things are right. How can you explain that without a God?
Right,
So this
exactly.
addresses that question.
So this question does assume in a way that there is a God.
Or it posits it
Or
for the sake of argument.
Yeah, for the sake of argument, in any case. It also assumes that this God that people are talking about would be omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient as well. And those are assumptions that many theists do make when it comes to their, well, at least monotheists tend to make those assumptions about their God.
I would actually argue that we don't need all of those omnis for this argument. Because I think when Socrates, the character of Plato, made this argument or asked this question, he was talking about the gods, plural, like the Greek gods or whatever, but you don't need a God that is able to stop all things that are bad from happening. You just need a God that can say, hey, please do these things and not these things.
Yeah, I mean, there are some parts of this that actually do get into the omnipotent or omnibenevolent part of it, but it's not necessary. Anyway, in the context that we're talking about, since we live in North America, where the most common religions are monotheistic, and those are assumptions about the gods, or the god of those religions, let's just go with that for the sake of clarity. So this connects to something called the divine command theory, and this is part of a lot of theistic, especially Christian philosophy, where God is necessarily good, and his actions, as are his actions, and all morality stems from God, or requires God's command for it to be meaningful. So that's sort of the premise that the apologists are working from in their philosophy and worldview for this. So going back to the Euthyphro dilemma, the statement there. So it comes in two parts. There's really two questions there, right? The first one, are morally good acts willed by God because they are morally good? What this really comes down to is that if this is true, then this means that God is drawing on some objective morality that is outside of himself. And there are rules that he must follow. So there is some morality outside of him that says these things are good and these things are bad. And God looks at that list and he goes, yes, cool. And he goes, people of earth, these things are good and these things are bad, right?
People of Earth, your attention, please. This is prosthetic foregone jokes of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council.
God is the divine messenger.
Pretty much, right? God is a messenger in this case because it is outside of him. He didn't come up with these things. These things were good, and God said, yes, I agree they are good. All of you people, hear these good things, or hear these things are not good. So if that is true, then there is an objective morality. So then the question is, because this morality exists independent of God, then God has nothing to do with morality at all.
Right.
Because that morality was there whether God was there or not. God followed that morality, so then thus it should follow that morality is there for us whether God is there or not.
God doesn't serve to explain morality.
Yeah. and the part where we were talking about the omnipotence and that, where this part of it comes into it is that if this statement is true, then this actually questions God's omnipotence because there is a force outside of him that constrains his actions. That morality force. If God is omnipotent, he can do anything, right? He has all of the power, he can do anything. He is all powerful. However, there's this morality force that says, no, these things are good, these things are bad, and because God is all good, he must do the good things and he must not do the bad things. Thus, his power is constrained. So he is not omnipotent.
Right, so
That's
either
really
he's not
interesting.
omnibenevolent or not omnipotent, or we have to take the other horn of the dilemma.
Exactly. Exactly.
Interesting.
So that is the first part. You're following me so far here?
Okay, I'm kind of terrified to ask this, but I have to know. What does that argument have to say about the whole free will thing?
Okay, there's a basilisk. And
So,
Holy shit, did we just create an evil god in the future that's going to torture us?
quite honestly, that part of it is, there are some good explanations for that I didn't actually
and it's really
include
long,
because
and
it was
Yeah,
longer.
that's-
There is some good information on the Wikipedia page, ironchariots.org, and then philosophyofreligion.org, I believe.
So I guess
are
I'm
my
just thinking about,
sources,
like,
and
if God is making you do moral things, do you still have free will?
yeah, so on my sources, I don't know that they were talking about that particularly, but
Okay.
there were some arguments about, does God then have free will?
Okay.
To
So
do
you can
things?
look it up online
So
if you're
you can
interested.
definitely look it up if you really want to go more in depth, but that is an excellent question. Okay, so that was the first question in the dilemma. So now let's go on to the second question, which is, are morally good acts morally good because they are willed by God? So again, is something good because God said it or did it, right? And that is what made it good. This is the other horn of it. So again, previous assumptions, God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, yada yada. So then all of God's actions must be considered good because they originate from God, and God decides and creates all of the rules of morality. So there's a few problems with this premise. First problem is that it's actually very arbitrary then.
Yeah.
Okay? So if there is no objective moral standard, how does God decide what is good or bad? What reasons does he use for this, right? Ultimately, God, the things that he says are good and the things that he says are bad could be just on a whim. There's no reason at all. So
And he kind of can't have reasons, right? Because if he had reasons for choosing good or bad,
it would imply that it's the first part.
That there's
it's the
an
first
outside
part
standard.
of the dilemma. Absolutely. So if there are no other reasons, then it's just completely whatever God felt like at that moment was good or bad.
Mind blown.
Yes, exactly.
did you have one of those moments when you finally got all this in your head and you're like, what is this?
It was pretty good.
2 hours before I arrived, was when you came to that eureka moment.
Yeah. This also implies that God can change morality as he chooses, because if all of the things that are good were just decided on a whim, why couldn't he just change it? Because there's no outside force, there's no outside constraints. He's just doing whatever he wants.
Also, but that's
Here.
what happens when the Pope says things like, the gays are all right.
They are all right.
So under, like, hypothetically, under this horn of the dilemma, if God were to say that throwing rocks at kids is what you're supposed to do, I guess if they talk back to their parents or whatever, then that would, in that moment, become the moral truth that is good. If God were to say that stealing is moral, then suddenly that
Yeah,
is.
and we'll actually get to that in a little bit more in depth. But no, you're exactly on the right path there. So really it comes down to it being very arbitrary. And of course, this is a very unsatisfying answer for most people. Like,
Yeah.
really, the whole universe is created on God's arbitrary decisions.
I definitely could not live with that.
No, absolutely. It seems completely illogical, and just there is no backing for that. So that's one of the first major problems.
I feel like I could live with a lot.
A second major problem for a lot of people is it's called the emptiness problem. It basically means that the statements about the goodness of God and the importance of God become useless at that point, because all of his decisions were completely arbitrary, based on nothing. Why is he good then? Why are the things that he does good? Saying God is good just means that God does things, essentially. Because if the things that God does are good, well, God does things. Okay, that's a thing. So then why should he be worshipped? Why is he deserving of praise? Why is he an important factor in our lives if he's just doing things? A really great statement that I found from one of my sources is quoting a philosopher with the last name Leibniz. He says that divine command theorists deprive God of the designation good. For what cause could one have to praise him for what he does, if in doing something quite different, he would have done equally well?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Right?
Sure.
I thought that really summed it up well for that. So it's just, okay.
If he does one thing or another thing, it's all good. I know what you're trying to say.
Yes, exactly. So that was just a really good sentiment there.
It does seem like if divine command theory is correct, we still seem to have come up with all sorts of rationalizations for why things are good and bad. We don't feel like, killing somebody is bad. Oh, it's just because God said. I don't think any of us feel that that's the reason that killing somebody is bad. We have other intuitions, moral intuitions that tell us that it's bad for other reasons.
Right. Yeah.
Divine command theory? Good
Yes.
name for a band.
There you go. And then one of the last major problems, and there are more out there, but this is one of the best known major problems, is that abhorrent or terrible things can then become good. If this premise is true, then God can say, everybody, murdering is A-okay. I insist that you do it once a day.
We'll call it the purge.
And then it becomes good. And that is a problem for a lot of people, because if God wills it, it must become good. So, and this comes back to what Jem was just saying with that internal morality. Most people feel that murdering is bad.
Yeah, and if you have to do it once a day, then that's going to be really quickly the end of humanity.
Right, okay, so that was an overstatement.
I'm
but,
just teasing.
Yeah, the idea is that if God took something that we've generally decided is a bad idea and said, this is how we roll now, we would have to then accept that.
I like that that's how he speaks.
Yeah.
This is how I roll.
And it actually really bothers me now that my example of, suddenly the gays are okay, some people would actually view that on the level of, now murder is cool.
Yeah, if God did decide
that
both gays are okay and murdering is cool, those are now equivalents, is what you're sort of saying?
There are people out there who would think of God deciding that the gays were okay. That would be a moral issue for them on the same level as God saying
equally as murder.
Yeah,
Right.
That's pretty upsetting.
And
That is upsetting.
another step towards this as well is that, remember too, that assuming that second premise is true, there is no outside limits to stop God from doing this at any time.
Oh man, that's terrible.
So, yeah, any moment now, God could turn around and say, nope, rape, murder, genocide, let's do it.
And
all the
arguably
time. And we would have to accept that as good.
Has done so.
Yeah.
And has done
Right,
so,
if you look at the Bible,
Absolutely.
that's a convenient way to explain all of the genocide that goes on there, right?
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. And that there are great examples of that pointed out in my references, which will be in the show notes there. So it's not hard to find examples of this. Yeah, it's not just that bad things could become good. It's that in this scenario, there are no limits to stop God, because we know that all of his decisions are arbitrary. So he could at any time, for any reason, or no reason at all,
He could flip
just
the
because
switch.
he was itchy one day and didn't like that, you know, whatever it was. So that's a pretty terrifying premise, if it were true.
If it were true.
If it were true.
Yeah, one of the things that apologists and counter-apologists will get into the weeds about is, the massacre of the Canaanites by the Israelites in the Bible, for example. And William Lane Craig has, so the Israelites were commanded by God to slaughter the Canaanites. And William Lane Craig has stated that was a moral good. God commanded them to kill all of them, women, children, livestock too, I think, and so people have pointed that out as a great moral evil that God commanded. And Craig stated that, yeah, we should feel bad about that. We should feel bad for the Israelites. Because can you imagine how horrible it would be to have to kill all those women and children? How hard that would be for them. But obviously it was a moral good. But it was just really hard for those guys.
It was harsh tokes.
Yeah. And a lot of people were justifiably horrified.
Yeah.
That's all I had.
So one of the things that I wanted to mention before we move off of Euthyphro is that some apologists will try to pick a third path. They'll call it splitting the horns. And they'll talk about this third option. So the two options that we have are either God commands things, and thus they are good, or things are good, and thus God commands them, outside of God. But there's a third path where they'll say that we can split the horns, and they'll say that things aren't good because God commands them. Goodness is part of God's nature. And so God is communicating these things, but they're not arbitrary, and he couldn't change them. They couldn't be otherwise. He is communicating what is good as part of his nature, but this still falls prey to a lot of the problems that Laura mentioned with the second horn of the dilemma, namely that we can't praise God for being good. That's a contentless statement. Right. Also, we can't even praise each other for being good. You were good, but just like in divine command theory, you were just doing the thing that you've been commanded to do. It is not intrinsically good in and of itself. It is not praiseworthy. It's just the arbitrary thing that you were told to do.
Right.
And this is not only unsatisfying, it's also not particularly intelligible, I think. What would it mean for goodness to be part of God's nature? And how is that fundamentally different from goodness being something that is outside of God's nature but is still being communicated? I guess that gets around the problem of us being able to take God out of the equation, but it still has the problem with God not being able to change it, so losing his omnipotence. It still has the problem with goodness being an empty idea.
So they didn't like the two options, so they were just like, we're going to make a nice fuzzy option that we can pick.
Yeah.
Right. Pretty much.
And the guys on Reasonable Doubts actually have talked about that splitting the horns of the Euthyphro dilemma on their podcast. And so I'll see if I can link to that in the show notes too. So Ian, you were going to tell us about the argument from design?
Yes, Jem, I was. We've already sort of touched on it a little bit with the look at the trees sort of idea.
Trees are awesome.
Trees are awesome. But I'd like to start with a quote. Jem sent me some stuff to look at for doing some research, and there was a quote at the very top of the research that was sent to me. So I will quote it now. Quote, "Then I started thinking, wait, the Big Bang. For a Big Bang to create all this is more wild to think about than thinking about there being a God. Imagine putting a bunch of gold into a box, shaking up the box, and it comes out a Rolex. It's so preposterous once people start saying it." And if you don't know that quote, it's from noted evolutionary biologist and cosmologist, Justin Bieber. So, and I really liked the snark of this article that you sent me, the research that it says, and so this quote is from Justin Bieber, but it's underneath where, the little dash, and it says, noted evolutionary biologist and cosmologist Justin Bieber. Yeah. So basically what he's saying is that if you took a bunch of gold and stuck it in a box and shook it around, you would get a Rolex. That's his explanation of what he thinks scientists think.
I have to say, I'm really impressed that Bieber came up with the word preposterous.
Preposterous, yeah.
I
should really make sure that quote is correct. Yeah, you're right. That is a little strange that he would say such a word.
And that's a variant of the sort of argument that you get a lot of the time. It's also called the 747.
The Boeing 747 thing?
Yeah, the 747 in a windstorm.
Yes.
A windstorm blows through a junkyard and assembles a 747 just randomly.
Because it's, Well, I didn't actually... You can talk about that if you want. We'll bring that up because it'll sort of play into what I'm about to say. I will do a slight read because I think this is a very good summary of the argument from design. And then we'll go into some more talky stuff. According to the argument from design, or teleological argument.
Teleological means having a purpose.
Having a purpose?
Yeah.
The design or order found in the universe provides evidence for the existence of an intelligent designer, or orderer, usually identified as God. The classic version of this argument appears in William Paley's 1802 Natural Theology, where Paley compares the complexity of living things to the inferior complexity of a watch that we know to be designed by an intelligent being. Just as a watch could not exist without a watchmaker, Paley argued, living things could not exist without an intelligent designer. The argument from analogy runs as follows. Since watches are the product of intelligent design and living things are like watches in having complicated mechanisms which serve a purpose, living things are probably the products of intelligent design as well. So basically what that means is that you look at the trees and you say, well, those trees are so beautiful and so, look at how well they operate and how they expel oxygen that we need to breathe, but yet they take in carbon dioxide that we can't breathe. Obviously that system is so perfect that it had to have been designed.
Right.
And there's obviously a ton of different variants and expansions on this idea, which plays, of course, into the idea of creationism or intelligent design in the sort of more how the universe got here in the first place type of thing, and why it is the way it is because it was designed as such by God in its entirety as it exists now, in contrast to evolution, where it was obviously an extremely long, protracted process of things trying and failing, and then something finally succeeds. Mm-hmm. The sort of creationist or intelligent design, and I think everybody who listens to this podcast and everybody sitting at this table pretty much already knows this, but the intelligent design idea is that it was designed as such in its current form by God or some other intelligent designer.
Right. So evolution does provide that alternative hypothesis, right? When you're talking about the design of life, it's a bottom-up design rather than a top-down design.
Right. There are obviously many other facets to this. The idea of, in support of the idea of intelligent design, and a lot of these have made the rounds, like irreducible complexity. Yeah. The idea that systems are so intricate and so complex that it's inconceivable that they could have that it could have come into being any other way other than being designed in the first place. And of course, the example they use is that the eye is so complex a system that it could not have just evolved. It had to have been designed. And then the sort of last one that I'm going to touch on anyway, the last sort of fore argument to the idea of intelligent design is sort of the probability argument, the idea that the likelihood of existence in the first place, that life exists as we know it today, is so improbable that it had to have had something to kickstart it, because it seems too improbable that we would have even, had life in the first place. So sometimes it's sort of linked into the finely tuned universe that, the universe is as it is, and God is making sure that it runs properly, but it's still created in the first place. And there's that sort of also goes into the idea that that we're talking about the perfect systems. Yeah. Things are perfect. You look at a tree, it's perfect. It processes things perfectly.
The idea that the universe is finely tuned for life is so absurdly preposterous that I can't even, the vast majority of the universe is instantaneously lethal to all known forms of life. Yes. If it was designed for us, it's not a very good design.
We really have this very tiny bubble.
Yeah, and this tiny skin.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think would be a good argument against the idea of the complexity of the universe?
Well, the fact that something is complex.
So complex that it had to have been designed, I mean.
Well, the fact, when you look at an information system, for example, complexity and design have nothing to do with each other, and frequently you want your design to be as you want to reduce complexity in your design. I mean, the more complex a system is, the more points of failure there are. You want your system to be less complex.
Yeah. The best example in this case is DNA. Like, DNA is not a very good system for transmitting information accurately and
decays
repeatably.
So quickly.
And yeah, if somebody was going to design a system to make things like us, DNA is a crappy way to do it.
One of the sort of examples that I came across that sort of flies in the face of this idea and sort of touches into the perfection thing, where you'd think that if we were designed, we would function a lot better
Yeah.
as creatures.
Yeah, the
I'll
argument
use the word
from,
creatures.
from poor design.
Yeah, so the fact that the eye, so complex and perfect a system,
No.
it fails, or I can take my glasses
Yeah.
off and I can't even see Jem's beard anymore. It's just a
You
big
can see
red,
this thing from space.
it's just a big red splotch. And I've always thought it, and I've used this before, that it's kind of an odd design that we eat down the same tube relatively. That we breathe out of, so it's easily obstructed while you're performing something that you need to do every day, like
Yeah.
eat.
Yeah.
And that we excrete waste from the same organ that we also use to transfer our DNA to other people. That seems like an odd design to me.
No, the same, not the. Well, okay.
It's the same.
For you, it's the same.
For us, it's the
yeah,
same.
okay.
I don't know about you. Maybe you have a different one. I don't know. But you'd think those would all be different systems.
Yeah.
That they have to double up on some of them to. I don't know. I guess that comes down to maybe that is a perfect system because they're making things less complicated.
Like the common phrase is running a sewage system through a recreation park.
Yes. And of course, the sort of complexity thing also, the sort of infinite regress sort of idea that, well, if something is complex
And it
it
needs
had
to be designed.
it had a designer, well, then that designer must be more complex than the thing it designed in the first place.
So
And then,
why don't we need an explanation there?
Yes, and then so if God is the ultimate designer, then who designed him? If he is ultimate complexity, then who designed the ultimate complexity?
Right.
Oh.
And well, it's always been there. God was always there. Okay, well then trees were always there.
Yeah,
there's no.
yeah,
you
yeah.
get to a point where you can neither side of the argument can really go any
Yeah.
farther, and it seems more likely that our explanation at this table is more likely.
Yeah.
The other
Who
one,
designed the designer?
sorry, the other one that always has bugged me even more than DNA because it impacts my everyday life is that if we were created in this current form, then we were really badly designed to be bipedal.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly
I'm-
what I was thinking of.
God, my
Yeah.
back. I had to lie on the floor this afternoon because my back was hurting so
Yeah.
badly.
That's
Like
a very
I'm
good point.
on our backs.
How are we supposed to reach that fruit from the tallest tree?
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
wait,
and
no.
I have something
We
called
didn't-
Scheuermann's disease, which means that my back is curved weirdly, and so just constant pain all the time because I was not designed to
Yeah.
be upright.
Good design. Also, about the complexity thing is that it also assumes the definition of complexity, where one person may look at a system and say, "Well, that's not very complex." Like Jam would look at a damn, spaceship and be like, "Eh, child's play." Whereas I would look at a spaceship and wonder what the hell I'm even looking at. So it also requires somebody to define complexity. Like they use the watch example. Yes, a watch is a very complex system if you have it next to a tree or something, but there may be different varying definitions of what is complex.
Oh, I'd argue that the trees.
Yeah, trees
way
are
more
really
complex.
complicated.
But from face value, I mean, and that's the point: is that there
Yeah.
is no sort of set definition of what is complex. So just to say that the watch is less complex than its designer means that you have to now define what complexity is in the first place. And
Right.
obviously, that's a floating definition for everyone.
And for
Yeah.
Paley's watchmaker analogy that he was making in natural theology, he was talking about like finding a watch washed up on a beach, and
Right.
you wouldn't assume that watch was natural when you look at it because of its complexity, I guess, compared to the sand and the ocean and whatever. The ocean's pretty damn complex. Anyway, but there are a couple of problems. Like, he is looking at this watch in contrast to all sorts of things
Yes.
around him. And he's saying, well, if you found this watch and you are comparing it to, the ocean and the waves, you would see how complex it is, so you'd see it's designed. But assuming that he's right and that life is designed, that whole beach is made of watches, right? The
that's-
sand is designed, the water is designed, the universe is designed,
Yeah.
right? So how is he making that comparison?
Yeah, there's no, it's in a bubble.
There's no
nothing to
contrast.
exactly, that's correct. And you're also, who was it that first made the
They're all
the
made of
beach?
watches.
The beach is watches. Who made that? Do you remember who made that sort of?
I don't
Yeah, that
remember.
quote. I've heard that quote before. That it's a sea of watches and a universe of watches, and the universe is a big watch. It's also comparing it to things that we know exist naturally.
Yeah.
In a bubble, in a vacuum, maybe that argument would make sense. But we know what a watch is. We
And-
know what a tree is.
And
so
that's
you
something
can't
that
compare the
came
two
up
things.
when these missionaries came to my door. They pointed at a house. Well, look at that house. Like that house was designed. We can see that it was designed. Don't you look at the universe and see the same thing? And looking at that house, I know it was designed, sure, but we know that from experience to a large degree. You know, a baby doesn't know that that house is designed. We see other houses being built. We see draftsmen designing them and construction workers building them. We have experience.
Yes.
I don't have experience with universe building because I'm not from Magrathea, I guess. Or
I think
planet building.
I think part of this too is that maybe not so much now, but 100, 200 years ago, it was a lot easier to see what was explicitly designed because we simply couldn't see what was like we couldn't see the internal workings of a lot of things. For example, you would look at sand and you go, oh, that's sand. You wouldn't look at it and go, there are thousands of different molecules in here, right? Or look at these incredible crystalline patterns, or we wouldn't think of something like that because we think of it as a whole, whereas a watch you can look at and you say, well, clearly there are gears and there's a piece of glass and there's some metal and there's some this and there's some that in there. So it's very easy to see that explicit design. Same thing with the house. It's explicitly designed. You can see the differences and where the design happens. Whereas when you look at a tree, you just go, it's a tree.
Well, and when you're looking at a house or a watch, you can say you have, as you're saying, this piece of glass, this spring here, and you can think of how could that have come to be in that arrangement?
Right.
And for a watch, we're like, well, the simplest explanation is somebody put it together that way.
Right.
But for a tree, we can see other processes putting trees together, right?
That is true. You can take a seed and watch the tree grow yourself. I will close this on the one of the famous sort of creation, and this is obviously fairly old. Everybody knows it. The Ray Comfort banana analogy.
The atheist's worst nightmare.
Yeah. That guy. If you don't know what it is, I think, correct me if I didn't actually write it up here. I'm doing this from memory, but I think the idea is that Ray Comfort, if you don't know who he is, I'm not even going to explain who he is.
Behold the atheist's nightmare.
If you want to Google him, fine, but I'm not going to give him the satisfaction. He basically said that a banana appears, it's first of all, it's curved, so it seems to almost like point at your mouth as you hold it.
Notice it has a point at the top for ease of entry. It's just the right shape for the human mouth. And it's even curved toward the face to make the whole process so much easier.
It easily opens up like a can of Coke. You just take the little tabby thing and you peel it down, and there inside it's delicious, it's easy to digest.
As with the soda can makers, they placed a tab at the top. So God has placed a tab at the top. When you pull the tab, the contents don't squirt in your face. It's chewy, easy to digest.
It's designed for humans.
Got a disposable wrapper.
It's got that's right, disposable wrapper that you can also use to shine your shoes.
It has the ridges on the outside that fit into the curve of the circle of your fingers.
Yes, it's about the size of a fist, so you can hold it easily. It's not like you're trying to eat a watermelon. It's easy to eat.
There aren't any seeds in it.
It seems like a perfectly designed that God designed this banana for us to eat.
Yeah.
Seriously, Kurt, the whole of creation testifies to the genius of God's creative hand.
Whereas, of course, the actual explanation is, Jim.
Humans designed that banana for us to eat.
Humans designed the banana. The banana is not. It's not natural. It's a cross-pollinization.
It's a cultivar. So that particular, it's probably a Cavendish banana that he was looking at, is a specific cultivar of banana. And if you look at wild plantains, they'll have seeds in them. The skin is a lot tougher. They aren't sweet and delicious like bananas. Right. There are lots of things about the banana that he specifically calls out in his video as evidence of God that were explicitly put there by artificial selection.
Yeah.
Yes, and I will half quote Matt Dillahunty from the Atheist Experience.
Yep.
If a banana proves that God exists, what does a coconut prove?
Yep.
They're really hard to eat. You got to use an axe to open them. And that's another part of it, is that to sort of put a close on this, and with a lot of these arguments, the inverse of this is never a point against
counter example.
Yeah, it's like, well, what does a coconut prove that God doesn't exist, and that or the devil made the coconut? We don't know. It's not. You can't use those arguments against.
Yeah, just like the argument from miracles. That my friend was saved from this. Was going to get on this plane, and then it blew up, and my friend didn't get on there because God saved her or whatever. Right. Well, so God decided not to save all those other people.
Yeah. And my super religious friend got hit by a truck yesterday. What is that? Not my. First of all, that never happened. I'm using that as an example.
My God, Ian, I'm so sorry.
No, that never happened. I'm just saying as an example that bad things happen to very religious people too. And I'm sure you could probably look through all of our lives and see close calls that you could say, That was a close one.
Yeah.
And if God saved me, well,
Yeah.
what the fuck is he doing? He screwed up.
God's an atheist. He wants to promote atheism.
Mind blown.
Hey, God would be an atheist, right? He's like, I wonder who created me. How did I get here?
Well, he would be an atheist to every other god.
Right.
So except for
It
himself.
turns out the Christian God was created by Ganesh.
There it is.
My favorite counter argument to the banana thing, the banana fits perfectly in your hand, but it also fits perfectly in your anus.
What is God trying to tell us?
Exactly.
Good.
Okay, so I've got one more argument that I want to cover, and then we have some fun stuff to talk about at the end.
Yay.
So this is a doozy. Sorry. It's the cosmological argument. I know everybody's groaning. I'm sorry.
No, I want to hear about it. Go.
We actually we talked about the cosmological argument briefly on way back on episode 18. It was our first Wi-Fi episode. But since it is one of the most popular and intuitive arguments for the existence of God, we'd be remiss if we left it out of our apologetics episode. So the cosmological argument, it's a classic. It goes thus: everything has a cause. There can't be an infinite chain of causes. So if you follow the causes backward, eventually you'll arrive at a first cause. That first cause must, by its nature, be uncaused, because it's the first. Nothing can exist without a cause except for God. Therefore, God exists.
That's stupid. I followed you to the point that you said that. I'm sorry. Go through that chain again.
So everything has a cause.
Uh-huh.
We can't have an infinite number of causes, so there must be a first one.
Sure.
The first cause can't have a cause, because it's the first cause. Nothing can exist without a cause except God.
Ah, there's your problem. Says who?
Yeah, okay, so sure, yeah. Why is God the getting the special treatment here?
Yes.
So this is actually a form of special pleading, where you demand different standards for your claim that don't apply to other claims. So here, everything has to have a cause except God. Why don't we say everything needs a cause except the universe?
Yeah.
There you go. We just stop it one step earlier.
The universe
Yeah.
is God.
There's all... Shut up.
Okay.
There's also the problem that the first premise and the second, third, fourth premises are all kind of in conflict. So the first premise is everything has a cause, and then the remaining three premises are like, well, some things don't have causes, guys. Let's not be so hasty. That's a problem. The argument also obviously says nothing about the nature of God. This could be a deistic God, so it doesn't get you to Jesus. God could be replaced with spontaneous quantum fluctuations, or eddies in the space-time wash, or even a big ball of wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey stuff. So the argument will work just as well. And it's actually not certain that premise one is true, that everything has a cause.
Yeah. Sorry, Jem. I was gonna actually ask. What do you mean by cause? Like it had to have existed, or it has to have a function?
It has to have a reason to exist. It has to have an explanation.
Yeah, something must have done something to
Something
cause
must
it.
have caused it to exist.
Caused
And I'll actually get into that a little bit deeper too. But as we discussed in a recent episode about free will, there may be some events, particularly on the quantum scale, that are fundamentally uncaused. It's also possible that the observed laws governing cause and effect are local rather than universal. Our experience of causality is limited to low energies and medium scales in recent times, so who knows if everything does in fact need a cause. It certainly seems that way in our everyday lives.
I'm sorry, I can't interrupt, but you're saying that because of our short time scale that we have as a human existence, it may be that at a different plane of existence that we're not aware that things don't have causes.
It may be. Yeah, or it may be that things on a very small scale or things on a very large scale, the micro or the super macro, don't need causes in the same way. And this explanation also fails the test of Occam's razor. Who remembers what Occam's razor is? Anyone?
It is that if there are multiple explanations for a thing, the explanation that requires the fewest extra assumptions is usually the one that's correct.
Yeah.
Nice.
The one with the
Well
fewest assumptions, or that posits the fewest entities, should be preferred. So if we have a choice between assuming that God is the uncaused and eternal first cause, and he created the universe, or we can assume that the universe itself is eternal in some form, this second option is more parsimonious, so we should stop our causal regress one step earlier.
Parsimonious?
Parsimonious, it requires fewer assumptions.
It's a beautiful word.
It's like thrifty. Thrifty with your ideas.
It's thrifty with extra syllables.
It is a good word. I've never heard that word in my life. I'm going to use it incorrectly in my everyday life.
Excellent. So a variant of this argument called the Kalam cosmological argument originated in the Islamic scholarly tradition, but is more recently being championed by popular apologist and amateur Scott Bakula impersonator William Lane Craig, mentioned earlier in the episode. Craig's formulation attempts to address the special pleading criticism. So where the cosmological argument states everything needs a cause except God, as Ian pointed out, Kalam says anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause, and we call that cause God. So we've replaced a rule that specifically exempts God from needing a cause with a rule that specifically exempts a category of things from needing a cause. That is, the category of things that don't begin to exist. Unfortunately, unless we can come up with something other than God that occupies the category doesn't begin to exist, this still amounts to special pleading. Yeah. Because basically what you're saying is instead of saying God doesn't have to follow the rules, this category of things that only contains God doesn't have to follow the rules. But there's also a couple of other subtle fallacies in this argument. One is the fallacy of composition. Specifically, the first premise, anything that begins to exist has a cause, talks about things, while the second premise, the universe began to exist, talks about the universe. But the universe isn't a thing. It's not a singular entity. It's the set of all entities, right? So a property that applies to all members of a set individually doesn't necessarily apply to the whole set itself. And properties that apply to a set don't necessarily apply to all of that set's members. So that may seem hard to follow. Bear with me. I'll give you an example. All atoms have the property of being invisible to the naked eye. Dogs are made entirely out of atoms, but dogs don't have the property being invisible to the naked eye. We can see them, right? So even though all of their component parts at the smallest level or at a small level have this property, being invisible, that doesn't mean that the set itself, the whole, altogether, the composite, has that property.
Right.
So even if it were true that everything that begins to exist has a cause, that doesn't necessarily apply to the set of all things, which is the universe.
Sure.
And here's maybe a weird question for you, and Ian, you touched on this earlier. Does anything actually begin to exist when it comes right down to it? Like, I mean, at the level of common usage, things come into being all the time, from chairs to mountains to people, but none of these things really begin to exist ex nihilo. They're merely rearrangements of pre-existing things, wood and rocks and cells and molecules and stuff, that we apply a new label to.
Well, I think that comes back to that thought experiment argument that we talked about with the axe, and that depending on the culture.
Grandfather's axe, ship of Theseus.
I think it really depends on what kind of view and cultural history you come from as to whether or not something begins to exist.
Well, however you want to phrase it, what I'm saying is, I think there's an equivocation going on here. So it's easy to agree that things begin to exist.
Sure.
we create something. But they begin to exist when they're made out of other things. So, human life begins at conception insert argument here. But for the sake of argument, right? Human life, your new person begins when these two cells merge, okay? But they were made out of other things. They didn't come into existence ex nihilo. So the first premise says everything that begins to exist has a cause, but that is talking about things that begin to exist from other things, right? This premise relies on our intuitive understanding of things beginning to exist, and every example of a thing beginning to exist that we can reason about is something beginning to exist from other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then premise 2, when it talks about the universe beginning to exist, it's not talking about the universe beginning to exist from other things. It's talking about the universe
beginning
just
to exist,
starting out of nothing, out of no pre-existing matter. It's not a new arrangement like the first premise is talking about. It's talking about the universe, it's on. And that is rather different. So if you're trying to make a logical chain between those two, that's an equivocation fallacy. You're using beginning to exist in two different ways to mean two different things. So you can't have that.
It's really not
logical
fair.
chain. There's another variant of the cosmological argument called the Leibniz cosmological argument, but I won't go into
Laura
it because
talked about that
I
guy.
think it's a different Leibniz, but I'm not sure. I can sense that if we start talking about that, our listeners their eyes are going to glaze over and their fingers are going to reach for the unsubscribe button the longer I ramble on. So, I just want to ask people a question.
I might do that, and I'm on this damn podcast.
What is the dumbest argument for the existence of God that you've come across?
Not like dumb, but it's dumb in my own mind that, people, and we've talked about this before, like people believe in God because, well, my mom wouldn't lie. They don't necessarily believe in, and maybe it's not as, I think people believe in not particularly religious, but they just, like my own mother, for example, she believes in God, but she doesn't go to church. She doesn't really identify with a particular religion. She just believes in God, and that's it. And I think that sometimes people don't even know the reason. So when you ask them, it's like, well, why do you believe in God? Well, I don't know. I just do. Somebody told me that there was, so I believed it. That seems like the stupidest effing thing that you could ever have.
Yeah.
To believe something just because someone told you so.
And I guess my dumbest thing would be very similar. And I understand the argument, but mine would be, well, I believe that God is real because the Bible says so.
Yeah, because the Bible told me so.
The Bible is the infallible word of God. And so
Yes, that's
obviously
That's
there's a
chicken
God.
and an egg situation.
Yeah, so
Name that logical fallacy.
Chicken and egg fallacy.
It's begging the question.
yeah. So I guess that one, when they
like
can't
my
come up
circular
with
reasoning.
more evidence than that, it really bothers me. Like, really? That's your best argument?
Yeah. I went through a list of arguments. The common consent argument always bugs me. That's the argument that basically says most people throughout forever have believed in a God.
Yeah.
They probably weren't wrong about something so fundamental to their lives, like so many people. So it's more plausible to believe that they were right, therefore God.
Sure.
So
sense.
obviously that's an argument from popularity, but
Yeah.
I'm also not super convinced. Like you were saying, Ian, your mom believes in God, but she doesn't go to church or whatever. I'm not convinced that it is actually that profound in a lot of people's lives. This belief in a God, it's
They just do, and then it goes
yeah.
into the back burner.
Even if they go to church, like most of the time when they're making coffee, when they're walking to work, when they're having fun with their kids, they're not thinking about God. They're not talking about God. They're they're just living their lives, man.
That's very true. And then there are other people who are the exact opposite of that. Everything is to do with God.
Yeah.
There's no getting around it. You can't go 5 seconds without mentioning it.
Well, and even in the
hate
Middle
those people.
Ages, I took a class that was basically the history of the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And the first thing the professor said was like, so you're going to have to deal with the fact that the history of the Middle Ages is basically the history of Christianity because it's just so ingrained in, and we were talking about Europe.
Right.
But even in the Middle Ages, people went to church because that's just what you did, and that's what the community was centered around. And they didn't. And we have examples going back thousands of years of like game boards being scratched into pews. That's one of the it's one of the best preservation techniques of ancient games is what was drawn on ancient churches.
the hell up,
Yeah,
really?
so people they weren't
No.
going to church every week because they were super devout. It's just what you did.
Well, and also the church
That's hilarious.
controlled everything
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
So it's not even a
There's a
matter
lot more,
of,
a lot
we
less
just
carrot, a lot
go.
more stick.
It was more so like,
Or
if
you'll
we
be
don't,
shunned
we
and-
will be
yeah.
shunned,
Yeah,
we
you
won't
can
get
only-
any this or that or whatever,
Only
we'll have our
imagine
land
being
taken away.
the
you know.
atheists in town in a medieval
Yeah, you just
Europe.
weren't.
Well, first of all, there
you
would be no
were,
such
but you
thing,
just didn't say anything. You just showed up, and it didn't even matter so much whether. And in those kinds of societies, I'm sure it could be argued that it didn't matter so much whether or not you believed, so long as you showed up and you paid your tithes and you did that, because it was a control thing. It wasn't actually a
Still is.
spirituality, right? But more so in that culture and time.
I was going through a list, and the actual dumbest argument that I found, and this is from a list that was like 20 reasons to believe in a God, and it was a totally legitimate list, but this one just stuck out at me. It was number 17. I'll link to it in the show notes. It is from strangenotions.com, and this argument I will present in its entirety. This is all they have to say about it. Number 17, the argument from aesthetic experience. Premise 1. There is the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Conclusion. Therefore, there must be a God. You either see this one or you don't.
Beautiful things exist, therefore God.
If any of our listeners have encountered strange proofs of God that they'd like to share with us, please send them in. I'd be delighted to hear them.
Oh, wait, I got one more. And this is, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but this is something that Katy Perry once said. And she did actually say this. This isn't a joke. Well, I mean, she apparently as a teenager or a child or whatever, she prayed to have breasts so large that when she laid down, she couldn't see her feet. And good job, God. Good job.
Okay, so we're going to end the podcast with a brief correction, a listener question, and a couple iTunes reviews. This is exciting. So, correction, real quick. Past host Greg Christensen was very disappointed that he didn't get a Star Trek reference in our episode about criminal justice. So he sent us in this correction. You failed to mention the tough-on-crime policies employed by the Edo. For shame, Jem. For shame. So, Greg, I have a present for you. This is relevant to this podcast.
This starship, could it carry my wisdom beyond the barrier?
It could, yes.
Then I shall make use of this starship.
It will be your chariot.
Excuse me.
It will carry my power to every corner of creation.
Excuse me, I'd just like to ask a question. What does God need with a starship?
Bring the ship closer.
I said, what does God need with a starship?
What a great question. What does God need with a starship?
Seems fair.
Excuse me. Shatner hamming it up.
What does God need with a lot of the stuff he needed in the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant, for example.
God, so much writing about all of the crap that they had to get
all those
together to build
foreskins.
stuff. No, not the foreskins, but has to be 100
all the
emeralds
gold
and the special wood and oh goodness, it was so terrible.
Okay, so we did have one listener question. And that listener question is, Ian, where are you going? We mentioned it came up on a previous episode that you were going to be leaving or something. So are you not going to be on the show anymore?
That's a hell of a good question, actually. I would like to be on the show, but obviously the fun part of this is getting together as a group and drinking coffee and sometimes having treats. And I don't want to harken back to the days where we did this over the internet, where there was, obviously a delay and blah, 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 blah.
It just wasn't the same.
It wasn't the same. And as much as I'd like to contribute, maybe we can try one or two and see how they turn out.
We could just have you on a laptop with Skype, and then the three of us or the four of us together,
and then put a
microphone right up to the Or we could probably just feed it right into the mixie thing.
Well, we'll start plugging in wires and hope for the best.
So to actually answer the listener's question, Ian is moving away.
Yes, my wife got into a relatively prestigious acting school in Vancouver called Studio 58. Just to toot her horn a little bit, she auditioned to get into two schools, one in Toronto and one in Vancouver, and she got into both.
Woo.
So we got to choose where we wanted to go, which was cool. And we chose Vancouver. It is a longer 3-year term, but it's cheaper, and it's Vancouver. So that seemed like the right choice to do. Longer time away, but the school itself is cheaper, and it's Vancouver rather than horrible Toronto. So yeah, I'm seeing that we're married. I am also going with her to pay the bills. Basically, that's all I'm there for, because she's going to be in school, so I'm going to be working my balls off to try to live in Vancouver, which is going to be very, very difficult.
Not going to be fun.
But,
good luck.
We'll miss you, man. And our listeners will miss you, too.
No, they won't. They won't miss me.
They'll miss you once the audio quality goes drastically down.
Which is something we need to talk about after this podcast is done.
If you want to help our audio quality not go down, you could donate some money to us. Jem has made us a fancy new page for it.
Yeah, if you go to lueepodcast.wordpress.com, there is a link on the side that you can click to donate via PayPal. You can also become a supporter of the show. We had some listeners request. We had a listener request.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. We had a listener request recurring donations. So you can do a recurring donation for just a couple bucks Canadian to help keep the lights on, keep the mics on, to support the show. So we'd really appreciate it because we do this, out of pocket. We make no money. There's no advertising.
We make negative money.
We lose quite a lot of money and quite a lot of time doing this show, but we like it.
Yeah, I have as I've said 1,000 times as well, I also have a wrestling podcast, which no one listens to. No one. Well, 16 people listen to, I should add. I spend hours editing it, and then I bug Jem to post it because I don't know how to do that. So Jem still has to waste his time to post my personal podcast about wrestling, and which I obviously appreciate. It's wasting time for zero gain other than my own personal enjoyment, and that's
fun.
good enough for me.
Fun is good.
Too.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. We have 16 subscribers or something.
Okay.
I haven't actually looked in a while. Maybe we have more now, but either way, I do it because I love to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So while we're doing plugs, does anyone else have any plugs? We should plug Laura's blog. Laura has a blog called Dietitian at Home, which we'll link to in the show notes.
Dietitianathome.wordpress.com.
And in the month of November, she is doing blog posts every day.
That's a lot of blog posts.
It really is. I think I overestimated my abilities considering that it is 10:30 and I haven't written one for today yet.
External motivation. So yeah, you should visit that. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's dietitianathome.wordpress.com. And it's great. She's a really good writer.
Thanks.
Yeah.
If you have suggestions for what Laura should write about the rest of the month, send them in.
Please do. That would be awesome.
Yeah. So Laura's a dietitian.
What is food?
It's a combination of
molecules.
molecules.
I don't know. I'll read about it on your blog.
Oh, and finally, iTunes reviews. So I'd like to remind our listeners that aside from giving us money, the best thing you can do to support our podcast is to go into iTunes and just give us a star rating. Even better is just write a couple words about why you like the show. It's
awesome.
It's the thing that is most likely to get us featured in the iTunes store, which really helps new listeners find us. And maybe that will mean that we'll get, more than a couple of donations so that we can actually afford to continue to, we can maybe afford to buy a mixer and, buy some better mics, something like that. So with that in mind, I'd like to read, we've got 2 recent iTunes reviews that I'd like to read. One, Smart, Funny, and Topical. It's a 5-star review from Jim. Jim said, "These folks cover a wide range of topics. They're well-researched and presented in a way that is easy to understand, conversational manner. These are smart people, and they're smart enough to explain themselves when they start getting too deep into a topic. There are over 100 episodes now, so you're sure to find a few topics you'll love." Well, thanks, Jim. That's very nice.
Wow, that was very nice. Not a disparaging word in the bunch.
Yeah. We also had a review from Diane, who called the show insightful and stimulating conversation. She especially liked the conspiracy theories episode. She had no idea so many existed. And Diane also said, "Jem is excellent at keeping it focused and pointing out logical fallacies." I think maybe one of those things is true.
We'll let you be the judge, dear listeners.
Yeah, there's a lot of editing that goes on. And a lot of sharp looks from my co-panelists when I start digressing.
It's Max from Laura.
Did you hear that? That smacking noise? That is an exaggerated noise for what happens often. But we love you, Jem.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thanks.
Well, I don't, but...
So leave us reviews, and maybe we'll read them on the show. And whether we do or don't, they'll make us feel good. So thanks.
Booyah.
And thank you for joining me, folks.
Thank you, Jem.
Thanks, Jem.
Have a good night.
Good night. You've been listening to Life, the Universe, and Everything Else. If you have any questions or comments, or you'd like to suggest a topic for the show, send us an email at lueepodcast@winnipegskeptics.com. If you want to show your support, give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or just share the show with a friend. Our music is produced by the very talented Ian James, and this episode was edited by Jem Newman.
I I just recorded that conversation, so hope you want it for prosperity.
Posterity?
Posterity. Prosperity? What did I say?
Prosperity.
Is that what I was supposed to say?
Posterity.
I'll posture your sterity, Newman. Rip that fancy beard off your face and wear it as a trophy.
Wow.
Is getting to the length where I could start, forking it?
Oh,
Jen,
God.
you just did that.
Okay, I'll undo it. Combing it back together. The discussion that ensues. I recently had a visit from a couple of very nice fellows from a local church, which I wrote up for my blog. I'll post a link in the show notes. Full disclosure, I haven't actually written this yet, but I'll get around to it by the time this episode is edited.
Now you have a deadline.
Up. Yeah, exactly.
It's on the internet, Jim. You cannot go against the internet. That's proof of God for me right there. Is that lady? She is well put together lass. Well, I mean, I've done a lot of quote unquote research into her as Jam is rubbing his forehead right now in frustration. I'm just gonna keep going though because it's
You know this is all getting cut, right?
I love Katy Perry.
I find her songs very catchy.
And she sings them live too. You can see some videos of her singing on various shows that it's not good, but it's live. I'd rather have a not good singer live than somebody who's miming it.
Did she do Just Dance? Is that her? Or is
No,
that
that
it's
was
Lady
Lady
Gaga.
Gaga.
Yeah, okay.
Katy
I don't know.
Perry
She did
is
Roar.
I Kissed a Girl.
Firework.
And I liked it.
Oh, for fuck's
The
sake.
taste of her cherry chapstick.
That's
I hope
playing
my
to your
boyfriend
audience
don't
right
mind.
there. That's playing to your audience right there. And thank you for joining me, folks.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jem.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Ampersand.
Also,
That's not your water dish.
Ampersand, get down.
Obviously, the fun part of this is getting together as a group and drinking coffee and sometimes having treats. I didn't bring Twizzlers today. I was running late, so I'm sorry.
Shit, hold on.
Whoa. Something in the oven.
Oh, good. Yay.
Yay.
Thank you. Because, all this fucking noise won't have to get cut out anyway, so I'm probably just going to have some of this Twizzler, and then we're just going to start again. Actually, you know what? I'm not even going to do that. I'm just going to start again.